All right. Well, today is Thursday, December 31st, 2020. And my name is Pisek. I am interviewing Ruben Perlmutter for the One Story at a Time project, Viva Shalom, celebrating Latin American Jews in Dallas. Good afternoon, Ruben. How are you?
I'm doing well. Good afternoon to you, and happy Goyish New Year.
Thanks for being on board. We're just gonna go through a couple categories to understand your family history, and for you to provide us with any great memories you have and stories that you'd like to share. And first off, I'd like to ask, what is the origin of your surname? If we can start off with that.
The origin of the surname is it's from Galicia, which was the Austrian section of Poland when Poland was partitioned a few times at the end of the 18th century. It was partitioned amongst Russia, Prussia, and the Habsburg Empire. And my father's family was in the Austrian part, so the surnames were Germanic.
Oh. And now take us back for a second and tell us where your grandparents are from.
Okay, they're from three different regions. My father's family is from, Galicia, what was then Eastern Poland, what is now Western Ukraine, where they were beginning from around, from the late 18th century. Our family tree goes back as far as 1800, at least that which we know of. It's from an area, 40, 50 kilometers south of Tarnopol. So it's the Tarnopol Oblast, if you will, in Ukraine. My father was born in Skalat. Excuse me, he wasn't born. His father was born in Skalat, Poland, and my grandmother was born, maybe 15 miles southwest. The name of the shtetl escapes me, but it was nearby. And as it turns out, she was my grandfather's cousin. So not uncommon in the old country, but my wife is horrified. What can I say? So my grandfather is the Perlmutter. My grandmother was, the father's surname was Metzius. But given that Jews often didn't have civil marriages, their last names were often the mother's last name, which was Friedman. So Regina Friedman Metzius and Jacob Yankel Perlmutter. Those were my grandparents on my father's side. On my mother's side, my grandfather, Bezalel Farber, was born in Dobrova, Bialystoka, a town about 30, 40 miles northeast of Bialystok, Poland, and about 15 miles west of Grodno, which at that time was, it was Polish, but it is now in Belarus. Excuse me, Grodno is now in Belarus, but Dobrova Bialystok is about 10 kilometers west of the Belarus border. And my grandmother was born when what is now Belarus, but was Poland, in a town called Divin, which is right on the Ukrainian border. But there was, the Great Fire of 1909 or 1910, and as a result, the whole family moved to Kobrin, Kobrin, which is a town near Brest now in Belarus, then in Poland. So they lived about, that was what, 100, 150 kilometers away from Dobrova. So my maternal grandparents did not know each other until they got to Cuba. So.
Wow. And what languages did they speak, and how was that when they transitioned?
They spoke Yiddish and
Yiddish and what?
and Polish.
And Polish, yeah.
And of course, you know, given the area, they you know, my father's parents also spoke a little bit of German and Ukrainian. So just to be clear, my mother's parents were what's called Litvaks. They were Lithuanian Jews.
Yes.
As opposed to the Galicianische Jews, the more Germanic, Austrian, Hungarian Jews from the region where my father was. So, but the primary language in the house was Yiddish.
Got it. All right. So then you said, then they moved and they met in Cuba, you said?
So I'll give you the story of how the multiple parts of the family got to Cuba.
Okay.
On my mother's side, my grandfather was born, I guess, in 1905. In 1923, he turned 18. He was going to be drafted into the Polish army, which was not a good thing, as conditions were harsh. So he fled the country, and because of U.S., you know, he had a brother in Montreal. He had a brother in New York. Because of restrictive immigration laws in the U.S., he came to the U.S. He couldn't stay, so he went to Cuba. And there, you know, he developed, you know, the family business back in Dobrova was textiles. They made rugs, so he started a textile business in Cuba. My grandmother came to Cuba in 1928 or so, and that's because she couldn't stand shtetl life. She didn't like the fact that her education had to be stopped in 5th, 6th grade after elementary school. She wanted more. She wanted more than shtetl life. She did not want an arranged marriage. So she left with a first cousin, you know, to where other family members were. As I said, I knew there was going to be a call.
You're good.
She left with a cousin to where other family was and went to Cuba, because she had a whole bunch of cousins who had ended up in Cuba, so she ended up in Cuba. I'm just gonna have to let this ring. My grandparents met in Cuba. They were married in 1929, 1930. My mother was born in 1931, the first of 3 children. So that's how that family, my mother's side of the family got to you know, to Cuba. Unfortunately, there weren't that many who came because of the Depression in the 30s. They told other family members, you know, don't come. The situation economically is not good in Cuba. You know, it's you know, better for you to stay where you are. You have businesses there. You can sustain yourselves. Obviously, had they known that the Holocaust was coming, they would have said something different, but they didn't. They did not anticipate what was coming, and so the bulk of the family was killed. On my maternal grandfather's side, there were 7 brothers and sisters. 4 were killed. You know, one had come to Montreal before. My grandfather went to Cuba. Another came to New York, but the other 4 were killed in the Holocaust. On my grandmother's side, 2 two of her siblings followed her to Cuba, but several other siblings passed away in the Holocaust. And my understanding is that they all were aggregated in the Grodno ghetto and were liquidated, were killed there. On my father's side, again, my father actually was in Europe during the Holocaust, during World War II. He was born in Lodz, Western Poland. Come September 1, 1939, and the German invasion, they fled to Skala, to the shtetl. My grandfather had a textile business, but since my grandmother hated shtetl life, they settled in the city. Lodz was the second largest, is and still is, the second or third largest city in Poland after Warsaw. I don't know whether Krakow was larger then than it is now. And they lived there, and my grandfather spent 2 weeks in the business in the shtetl of Skala and 2 weeks in Lodz. Come the Nazi invasion, they went to Skala, even though Stalin took that part of Poland as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop accords that basically created 2 years of peace on the Eastern Front to allow the Russians to build up their army for the inevitable war and allowed the Nazis to focus on the West.
Right.
So they spent time in Lodz, then in Skalat, and then, once the 2-year treaty expired, the Nazis invaded. They quickly came into Skalat, and my grandmother was captured in the first action of the shtetl and was killed in Belzec, the Belzec death camp. I think November 9th, 1941, was it? It may have been 1942. I forget the exact year. I have to look it up. And my father and his father worked in the labor camps. In particular, two, one called Hluboczek, which was 5-10 kilometers north of Tarnopol, and then Skalat itself, the shtetl that they were in, also had a labor camp, and they spent the majority of time in that labor camp after family members who lived in Tarnopol bought them out of Hluboczek, which had the conditions were worse. Then the final action to liquidate the Skalat ghetto, took place, I believe, sometime in 1943, and somehow my grandfather and father got advance warning, and they went into the forests surrounding Skalat, and they hid there for 9 months, including through winter, until Russian partisans liberated Skalat in 1944. And so this was a ping pong. They went from Hitler to Stalin, back to Hitler, back to Stalin. And in time, once the war ended, they left Skalat back to Poland. They were intending to go back to Lodz, but one of their neighbors, one of their Jewish neighbors, was killed trying to take back their house, their property, from the non-Jews who, basically squatted in that property. And so they were told not to. So instead, they stayed in Żabrzeń-Gliwice, in the southern part of Poland. My father graduated from high school there. And then when the Stalinists took over, they left. They fled Poland just as the border was closing, and they, train bussed to Paris, from Paris to London, from London to New York, where one of my grandfather's, paternal grandfather's brothers lived. They were in New York for 6 weeks and then went to Cuba. Again, immigration restrictions were not favorable to Jews, but they were able to go to Cuba. That was 1947. They settled there. My father had to repeat a couple of years of high school because he didn't have his diplomas, and he also, I guess, had to learn Spanish, which he did. So he had to repeat some years of high school. He went to the University of Havana, where he met my mother, who was a student there as well. They were the same age, so they were in the same social group. They met, they were married in 1957, and I was born in Cuba in 1958.
Did your grandfather also come to Cuba on your dad's side?
Yes, my grandmother was killed at Belzec. My grandfather survived and was with my father, in the labor camps, in the ghettos, in the forest, and ultimately, as they walked across, traveled across Europe to escape, ultimately. Both grandparents were in the schmata business and textiles. My maternal grandparents had a factory in Marianao, which was a western suburb of Havana, and they made work pants, dungarees, under the brand names Huracan and Caiman, Hurricane and Cayman. My paternal grandfather also was in the textile business. And so when my parents got married, they thought it was, combining businesses, and that just wasn't the case. Both, were capable of running the businesses. My mother has a keen sense of business. My father studied engineering and knew how to cut cloth, but both chose academic careers instead.
Now, can you tell us about how they were involved, or what their Jewish life was in Cuba?
Sure. Neither was particularly religious. My father a bit more so than my mother. But that was your community. In many ways, it was like Israel. I mean, in the sense that in Israel, you don't have to go be religious to show that you're Jewish. Everybody there is Jewish. Well, in their circle of friends, in their circle of business, everyone, was Jewish. But my grandfather belonged to two shuls. There was a shtibel in Marianao that they were members of. And then in the early 50s, 1953, 1954, well, let's take a step back. In the Jewish community in Havana, obviously you had your Sephardic community and your Ashkenazi community. They had separate institutions, separate schools, separate shuls.
Right.
The Jews initially settled in Old Havana. And then, with that was the initial generation. And to the extent they got more affluent, they spread largely westward and also southward. The initial synagogues, at least the Ashkenazi synagogues, were built in the first decade of the 20th century. There was one, and then, as usual, there was some sort of disagreement. So they split into two, and they were actually next door to each other, which is, so typical. And then in the 1950s, as the community was moving westward, the Ashkenazi, both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi communities opened up new complexes in what was called Vedado, El Vedado, which was a relatively affluent suburb about 5 kilometers west of Old Havana. And the Ashkenazi synagogue was called, the nickname was El Patronato. And it's a large complex. It still exists today. It was a synagogue, a function hall, and then there were administrative offices and classes. The administrative offices and classes have since been sold to the Cuban government, which opened the Bertolt Brecht Theater there. At least they named the theater after a Jewish person after they essentially expropriated the property. But it was a large complex to open in the late 50s. Then, of course, the Orthodox community also opened up a new shul in Old Havana, and that opened, right when Castro came to power. In any event, my maternal grandparents were members of both Stiebel and Marinao and Patronato. My father and his father lived walking distance from the Patronato and were members of the Patronato when it opened. I would suspect that they were, members of one of the Ashkenazi shuls in Old Havana before they opened the new branch, but it's not something that I know of. I do know that they were members of the Patronato. That's where my parents got married in 1957. With over 500 people. Because you couldn't just invite family, you had to invite all the business people that you did business with, and so they were big affairs. I guess what am I missing out?
And so, do you still have family there?
I do not have family there. There are people that know my family. Let's take a step backwards. There are anywhere from 15 to 25,000 Jews in Cuba, most of them in Havana. There's also a significant community in Santiago de Cuba, in the eastern part of the country, and Jews, here and there, doing commercial activities around the country. The Jewish community, had their own schools, had their own infrastructure. So the Jewish day school, which was patterned on a school in Mexico City, which was called the Yiddish, where they taught Hebrew and Spanish, not Hebrew, they taught Yiddish and Spanish as languages. They opened one up in Havana, in Old Havana, and in the 1950s, it moved to a southern suburb, now just a southern neighborhood called Santo Suarez. And my mother was a student there and ultimately became a teacher there before moving on to a public high school. She was a teacher of biology at the Instituto de Segunda Enseñanza de Marianao, basically, the high school of Marianao. And then my mother had a doctorate. She had a doctorate in natural sciences from the University of Havana. She graduated, I guess, in 1953. Then took a year of graduate studies in the University of Miami, and then sort of returned. I think my mother would have preferred staying and getting U.S. PhD on top of her Cuban doctorate. But the pressures, women don't have careers, they should get married. And so I think my mother succumbed to that pressure and came back to Cuba and started dating, met my father, and ultimately got married. But in Cuba, she had a career. and ultimately she became a professor of comparative anatomy at the University of Havana. She was the purportedly the first Jewish faculty member at the University of Havana, and she was able to obtain that position because of Castro.
Okay.
In order to get a position at the university during Batista and his predecessors, you had to know someone. There was a tremendous amount of corruption. Not that Castro wasn't corrupt, because Communist Party members got favoritism, but national exams, and my mother scored first, but after two Communist Party members, she got the third slot at the University of Havana. I guess what I'm saying was there was so much corruption that the foremost expert in the Spanish language in Cuba could not get a position at a university. Dr. Fonseca, he was not Jewish. He taught at the same high school as my mother, and became friends. And I remember seeing him on every time we went to Miami. We'll get to that aspect of our lives, because he didn't know one, and he didn't know anyone, and he didn't pay a bribe.
Right.
So in that sense, meritocracy was not high in Cuba, and that was something that my mother hated. But nonetheless, she got a position with Castro, but that wasn't going to last long. On the other hand, my father, he graduated with an engineering degree, but my maternal grandparents had to buy him a position. He didn't get a job. He ultimately got a job at Goodyear in Matanzas, a town about 90, 100 kilometers east of Havana, because my grandfather paid for him to get the job. It wasn't that he wasn't qualified. It's you have to know someone. That everything was corrupt. After, and this happened after I was born. After I was born, we went to Matanzas. Then we came back to Havana, and then how did we get to the United States?
So right before we get to the U.S., this was super interesting to hear, your take on how the world event of Castro taking over Cuba, and your parents and a little bit of you having to go through that.
Well, let me put it this way. The Castro Revolution had a tremendous amount of popular support because he wasn't overtly communist.
Right.
There was significant dissatisfaction with the corruption of the Batista regime. So people wanted a change. So when Castro came, and his victory was miraculous, because you're talking about 600 fighters. This is how corrupt Batista was. Thousands of soldiers, and they couldn't defeat 600 guerrillas because of the corruption, lack of discipline, and lack of willingness to sacrifice. It was. There's no way that Castro should have won, but he did, just because of the weakness and corruption of the Batista regime. So it was popular, but then increasingly it became clear that Castro was being pushed left, whether it was by Che Guevara or others. I mean, he was a socialist. He was in the 50s. He was arrested. He was a member of the Ortodoxo Party, which was the Socialist Party, but he wasn't big C communist yet. But clearly, he was moving in that direction. And the American reaction to Castro pushed him further to the Soviet camp because they were his supporters. They supported Castro as the U.S. was trying to undermine him. And so once it became increasingly clear that um, that this was going to be a leftist communist regime. They were taking away, they were nationalizing businesses, they were suppressing freedoms. Now, my father had been through that. He survived Hitler twice, he survived Stalin twice, and basically he said, forget it. Meanwhile, my paternal grandfather thought that the United States isn't going to allow this, so he continued to build his business. My maternal grandparents started diversifying, and they had friends in the United States who came, and they took out casino winnings out of the country and stashed it in Miami. So ultimately, at the end of 1960, when we left Cuba, my maternal grandparents had some money to restart, whereas my father's father had nothing. But then again, my father's father had had leukemia for 10 years, and his health didn't allow him to restart anyway. But so our at least my mother's side of the family started thinking about the future. Their factory was nationalized, their pan factory was nationalized. They had real estate that was nationalized. Ultimately, they left in November, December of 1960 separately. My grandmother first. My grandfather was detained for a while and came later. We left in October beforehand. Why did we leave? My father doesn't repress his speech. Believes in free speech, and he was criticizing the Castro government because he said, I know what communism is. I went to school in a Stalinist country or a country under Stalinist control. I know what it is. This is not good. And the bloc mayors, if you will, members of the Communist Party who lived on the block, went to him and said, either you keep quiet or we're going to send you to cut sugarcane in the countryside. My father left the next day. We left 10 days afterwards with 21 suitcases and my tricycle on tourist visas to the United States. And we were met not only by my father, who had left 10 days earlier, who had arrived 10 days earlier, but a whole crew of my mother's classmates from the University of Miami met us at the airport with several cars into which we loaded our 21 suitcases and tricycle. So that's how we got to the United States. An interesting side note, one of my mother's classmates, well, not a classmate, she was actually younger, freshman or sophomore at the University of Miami at the time that my mother was there, and we became very good friends, or my mother became very good friends with her, was the mother of Ron Dermer, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, who I remember in diapers. Because again, we used to see, Yafa was the mother, who was the classmate of my mother. We saw them every year that we went to Miami to visit my grandparents. She married Jay Dermer, who became mayor of Miami Beach, and one of her other sons became mayor of Miami Beach as well in the 90s. And of course, Ron Dermer is the ambassador to the U.S. and has long been an advisor to Netanyahu.
So you moved to Miami in 1960.
We moved to Miami in October of 1960.
Okay. And how was that transition on your parents and grandpa?
Well, the transition to the United States was very difficult on my mother and forever.
Right.
Impacted her because my grandfather became a relatively affluent person in Cuba, and the lifestyle that my mother led was very comfortable. cars, chauffeurs, maids, cooks.
Right.
It was a very comfortable life. She had to give it up, and she she knew she had to give it up, but I don't think she ever fully recovered from it. It's, before you didn't have to worry about making ends meet, and then for the first 10, 15 years until my father was more established, you had to count pennies.
Mhm.
So that loss of wealth, I think, impacted um, my mother. For my father, um, first of all, you have to put it in perspective. He survived the Holocaust. So
Right.
when he went to Cuba, for him, Cuba was paradise. Not only did he not have to go and spend winters in the Eastern Polish, now Ukrainian forests,
Mhm.
freezing his ass off, but there was food everywhere. He wasn't starving. There were food stalls everywhere. He could have, you know, for him, Cuba was paradise. There was food, there was warmth, and no one was trying to kill him until Castro came.
Mhm.
And not that they would have killed him, but they might have jailed him. So for my father, Cuba was paradise. For my mother, who is an intellectual and who firmly believes in meritocracy, she was on the one hand very happy to leave Cuba because she couldn't stand the corruption and the lack of meritocracy that infected Cuba. So she always used to say, "I thank Castro every day for allowing me to come to the United States." But the flip side of that was I don't think she ever recovered from the loss of family wealth. So um,
And now, how many siblings do you have, or were you the only?
no, I have a sister.
Okay.
I was the only one born in Cuba. I was born in 1958.
Okay.
Um, and I left when I was 2.5.
Right.
And again, we lived in Marianao and in Matanzas. In Marianao, we literally lived a block from my grandparents. They had a nice house, which is now divided into two, and some general from the Cuban Army occupies most of it. And my parents and I had occupied an apartment just a block away, and we lived 2 blocks away from the famous Tropicana nightclub. Excuse me. All right.
Yeah.
Again, I apologize. That's going to happen
You're good.
from time to time. Um,
So,
so, so I was born in Cuba. My sister was born in 1963 in Queens. Uh, I think my parents did want to have a child earlier, but I think the stress of moving from Cuba impacted my mother physically, and that was not possible.
how did they get to Queens?
All right, so as usual, the first stop for Cuban Jews is Miami.
Okay. Yeah.
Miami Beach for 6 months while my father was looking for a job. And it was an extensive search. And he finally found a job at Wrangell Breweries.
Mm-hmm.
And he was fortunate that the head of research and development was a Jewish engineer, Dr. Joseph Awades, who has a certain amount of fame in the brewery business for reasons I will tell. And he took a liking to my father and hired my father because my father's engineering background was sugar engineering, which was important in Cuba, and that sort of fit the brewing business relatively well. And my father worked at Rheingold for 7 years, from 1961 to 1968. And what Dr. Awades is known for, and what Rheingold is known for, is developing the first commercially available light beer.
Okay.
It destroyed Wrangell because America was not in its diet phase, and the idea of light beers were not popular until the early 70s. So Wrangell went down the tank, but the brand was Gablinger's.
Mhm.
So Wrangell sold the formula for Gablinger's to Meisterbrow, which then sold the formula to Miller Brewing Company.
Mhm.
And what my father worked on is now Miller Lite.
Wow.
So
It was all in Queens?
it
Oh
was
my,
in Brooklyn. It was in Brooklyn. The
Brooklyn.
plant was uh, in Brooklyn, along with several other breweries. It was near the Schaefer Brewery plant. All these brands that no longer exist, as you know, Miller and Budweiser have eaten up the market. But somebody may still have a license and still brew Wrangell from time to time. But
How was how was that move on your mom?
it,
Yeah.
it was a move. I mean, it was, you know, we moved in 1961. My mother made a conscious decision not to continue her career.
Mhm.
And I think that was tough on her. And as a result, she focused on, you know, educating and raising the kids.
Right.
So, you know, between the frustration of having to give up a career and not having the financial affluence that the family had in Cuba, the whole transition to the United States was tough, and it was never something that I don't think my mother ever fully
Recovered.
reconciled with. So I think there was some sadness, some frustration, and but you know, hey, from my father's perspective, I'm in the United States. I'm
Mhm.
not being chased by Nazis or communists. I
Mhm.
have a decent job. You know, my father, in that sense, I think was a satisficer.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because of the Holocaust, there were certain other things that were part of his psyche, like you had to finish everything on your plate, because he was starving in the forest, and children were starving in Biafra, um, and also things couldn't break. If the car was dinged, it was the end of the world. Again, because 5 times he had to give up everything. When he left Lodz, then when Skalat was liquidated, then when he left Gliwice, and then when he left Havana, and it's you know, the notion of permanence you know, became important for him in terms of tangible things.
Right.
Um, so so my father was fine in that sense, although this is a non sequitur. He did not speak about his Holocaust experiences until about the 90s. It,
Wow.
it, it, it took him almost 50 years. It took him 45 years in order to begin, you know, dealing with it. Um, and in Queens, he had, you know, one of the things that I think made the transition smoother in Queens was that he had two first cousins
Mhm.
um, living nearby.
Right.
One he had a good relationship with, um, and uh, this was a cousin who was from Tarnopol, lived in Tarnopol, and um, basically helped provide food when he was in Lubotchik, and also helped pay money to get him and my grandfather out of Lubotchik and back to Skala.
Mhm.
So, you know, close relationship. They had done stuff for him during the war. There was another first cousin where the relationship was not as good, but my mother sort of bridged the gap, basically saying, you got to forgive what people did when they were young. These were cousins who, when each time the Germans had, you know, a sweep to sweep up Jews and send them to Belzec to die, they tried to keep my father and grandfather out of their hiding place because it was crowded. Ultimately, my grandfather and father forced their way in. But it wasn't until my grandfather died finally of leukemia at the end of 1963. And I don't think that we socialized with them until after that. I think my grandfather never gave up the grudge. He was angry and remained angry till his dying day. Whereas then my mother softened my father and said, "You don't have much family. You lost most of your family in the Holocaust. This is a first cousin. You know, have a relationship with them." And we did. So, but having family in Queens helped soften the blow. And again, my father, he was happy to have a job. No one was trying to kill him. So he was a satisficer in that way. So it was fine. For me, I had transitional issues in terms of identification. You know, it's one of the things that happened. My maternal grandparents, they took money out of Cuba, as I said, and my grandfather worked at a wholesale retail store for a few months and then bought the store. So he had a wholesale retail store in Miami for 14 years until he died. And so he had a thriving small business.
This is on your dad's side?
That's my maternal grandparents.
Maternal.
My father's grandfather had leukemia, lived with us. He did not reopen his business since he lost everything because he thought the US was never going to allow a communist to govern Cuba. And so he did not begin to divest his business. He continued to reinvest in his business and he lost everything. My grandfather took out some money, but again, lost not only his business, but lost all the real estate that he had bought in Havana, or I should say my grandmother diversified and bought real estate. Unfortunately, she didn't diversify geographically, and she bought in Havana instead of Miami. So my grandfather had a wholesale retail store in Miami, and we used to go there every summer, if not during winter break, before I went to school, and used to spend the summers in Miami working at my grandparents' store, going to camp, and just basically socializing with the Cuban Jews family and friends who were in the Miami area. There weren't that many Cuban Jews in New York, but there were, classmates of my mother in school, non-Jews. So we also had that social aspect. And one person who used to work for our family emigrated to New York, and so there was a group of Cuban family, there was a group of Cubans, and so in that sense, the transition was a bit smoother. For me, the identity issues were, we used to go to the Lower East Side to buy merchandise from my grandfather's store. I used to go with my mother. We lived at that time, initially, we lived in Brooklyn before going to Queens, and we used to take the J train into Manhattan. And of course, it crossed Williamsburg. And so, the story is, I'm too young to remember, but everybody tells me about it. The Hasidim, get into the train, and I go crazy. Mama es Fidel, es Fidel. It's Fidel Castro, because they had the beard. Fidel. I also thought that everyone who spoke Spanish was Jewish, so that it took a while to disabuse me. One other aspect, sort of a funny story, when we emigrated to Cuba, as my nanny in Cuba was a Fidelista, a Fidel supporter, and so she used to, have the radio playing his speeches, or to the extent there was, he was on TV, had the TV on with the speeches. So when I got to Miami airport at immigration, apparently I started chanting "Cuba si, Yankee no, Cuba si, Yankee no," which was, Cuba yes, Yankee Americans no, which was sort of a chant of Fidelistas in Cuba, and sort of there was
Yeah.
a little horror at that from the airport. So there was an adjustment for me, and also an adjustment that it's my mother tried to take the place of the nanny, so I didn't necessarily know how to do things for myself until kindergarten, where I was forced to to start learning how to do things for myself, like tying my shoes and buttoning my pants, and I quickly got the hang of it. But
And
those were the adjustments, sort of the identity because of the Spanish language, being Jewish and Hispanic at the same time, and sort of the transition from a family of affluence with people who took care of you to being just middle class, and having to support yourself and do things yourself. So next question. Sorry,
yeah.
I'm going on
No,
tangent.
this is super interesting, really. And I forgot to ask, did your parents have the opportunity to learn English before they came to America?
Well, my mother, yes, because she went to graduate school, University of Miami. Not only did you
Right.
study English in school in Cuba, but she had a year in the United States where she learned English. My father, being in Poland, which was always being conquered, at school, not only did he speak Yiddish at home, Yiddish as the common language of the home, but in school he learned Polish and German and Russian, and then when he went to the to shtetl, the Ukrainian, um, and uh, um, and then in Cuba he learned Spanish, and in school there you learn English as well. So he spoke multiple languages, and in our family, initially Spanish was the language of the home. Yiddish was the secret language when my parents had to tell secrets, and ultimately it transitioned to English. By the time I was 5 or 6, I could understand Spanish, but I really wasn't speaking it as much. But I went to Miami all the time, and I spoke to my grandparents in Spanish. So, and spoke to them on the phone in Spanish. So I was always speaking Spanish, but my verbal Spanish was deteriorating with time. So,
And now, did you grow up? How did you grow up Jewish wise?
Well, I'd like to say I come from a long line of agnostics.
Okay.
Culturally, with a strong cultural and ritualistic affinity to Judaism. My father's father was not particularly observant. My father wasn't particularly observant. My mother's parents, my mother weren't particularly observant, but A, they spoke Yiddish. B, in New York, I guess you'd call us 11-day Jews. Because come Passover, we had 2 sets of different dishes. We had, we didn't keep kosher normally, but on Passover, everything was clean, sanitized, and we had a separate fleishik, Pesach set of dishes, pots, pans, cutlery, and the milchika set. And so I would say, from a cultural standpoint, we were very Jewish. From a religious standpoint, not so much.
Okay.
But of course, I went to public school, and then I went 4 days a week to what they call Talmud Torah. We were conservative Jews, and I went 4 days a week, through 6th grade, where I thought what we learned about Jewish history was good, what we learned about Jewish ritual was good. I thought that the teaching of Hebrew language was awful, awful. I learned how to speed read Hebrew,
That's good.
but not speak it. But the one thing that I did learn was, how to daven, and that was, let's face it, my mother and father both believed in high academic achievement, and if there was an award to win, you go out for the award. I found out after the first year you can get an award if you go to synagogue. So I started going to synagogue every week, and my father was a singer and his mother was a singer, and I had the ability to sing. So I became a chazan in junior congregation beginning at age 9. And that has carried on because today, I have been a high holiday cantor since I was 19 years old. So I'm 62 now. So that's 43, 44 years. I started in 1977 as a high holiday cantor at the conservative service at Harvard. And then I was asked by the Reform Tehillah to, rather than doing just the Torah service during the high holidays for the conservative service, I could be the principal chazan at the Reform service. And so I did that for 18 years while doing the second day of Rosh Hashanah at the conservative service, and there for a few more years. And so I was at Harvard for a total of 20 years. Then we moved to Mexico, and it's later in the story. And I was a chazan there for 1 year until they switched rabbis, and that rabbi wanted to do everything. And then I came to Dallas in 2001, and within a few years, I became the Bal Musaf and did led Kol Nidre for Congregation Anshe Torah. And I've done that the last 15 years, I guess. So.
Is that what brought you to Dallas?
No, what brought me to Dallas was sort of my job and my wife.
Okay. And so how long were you in New York, you said?
So I was in New York on and off for 33 years.
Okay.
With 7 years elsewhere in college. So I grew up, we were in Brooklyn, two blocks from Queens. Then there was more family. My mother had an uncle who lived a few miles away from us. And then we moved into a neighborhood called Kew Garden Hills, which is now a very Orthodox neighborhood, but then was, 80% conservative Jewish, 10% Orthodox, 10% other. So having a Jewish identity wasn't a problem because pretty much everybody there was Jewish.
Right.
Went to school, and because the teachers were so heavily Jewish and they controlled the teachers union, you had Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuos, the high holidays all off. So it's very easy to be able to
feel Jewish,
celebrate Jewish holidays and participate in synagogue and ritual life. So we were there. My father worked in Wrangell till 1968. Then he switched to a job in Stamford, Connecticut, but he was going against the traffic, so it was an easy commute. And then in 1974, I guess, he started a new job in Wayne, New Jersey at GAF. And he was going with the traffic, but because I was finishing up my senior year in high school, he stuck it out for that year before they moved to Jersey. I went on to college in Boston. I went to Harvard College and worked for 2 years and went to Harvard Law School. So I spent 7 years in Boston, and came back to New York and worked in New York law firms for 8 years. And then in 1990, well, gotta
Yeah.
tell how I met my wife, but in 1993, I got a job in Bell Atlantic, in their legal department, and they were headquartered in Philadelphia in those days. They're now Verizon. And the reason that I was hired is they were looking for a Spanish-speaking lawyer because they were about to purchase cellular property in Mexico. And so they needed someone who spoke Spanish. That ended up being me.
Yes.
But I met my wife 3 years before. My wife is a Dallas native, but she was working in Washington, D.C., and my firm that I was working for collapsed after, well, their business suffered significantly after the 1987 market crash. So they sent me to their DC office to do government contracts work, which is not what I was trained to do or was interested in doing. But because there was no real business, I was able to do more social things. And one of the things that I did was Israeli folk dancing, first initially at the 92nd Street Y and at Columbia University in New York. And then when I was sent to Washington, D.C., I continued to do that in D.C. and met my wife Israeli folk dancing, which is apparently the way my family finds spouses, because my sister met her husband at Israeli folk dancing as well. So I met my wife in Washington, D.C. in 1989, and I was about to get a new job, but I postponed it until I was certain that I wanted to continue with the relationship, and that began a long period of commuting. We commuted between New York and Washington, D.C. We got married in 1990.
In DC?
I couldn't find it here in Dallas at Sheriff Israel.
Okay.
And then I found a job in Philadelphia. I'm a corporate lawyer. There were no real corporate jobs in DC at the time. Corporation headquarters didn't move to DC in the late 80s, early 90s, in the number that have subsequently moved there. So right now it would be much easier for a corporate lawyer to find a job in DC, but back then it wasn't. But I was able to find the job at Bell Atlantic in Philadelphia, which was at least halfway there. And my wife was working for a government contractor whose office, at least the office of that unit, was just outside of Philadelphia. So Philadelphia was a rational place to get together. But we finally moved in together in 1995, just before our son was born. And then as soon as that happened, I started going to Mexico a lot more often, as that investment was difficult. And ultimately, Bell Atlantic took control of that entity, and I moved to Mexico City to become general counsel of that Mexican cellular entity, Grupo Usacell. My family joined me there. My son had been born.
Now, your wife, is she also Spanish speaking, or what's her background?
She should be, but she isn't. So I'll let me take a step back. My wife is Lauren Bush. Her mother was Carolyn Lipshe. Her father, Sylvan Bush. Sylvan Bush was from Philadelphia. Karen Lipshe was here in Texas. And Lauren was born in Dallas, went to Green Hill, and then I guess, W.T. White High School. So she's a longtime Dallas native. She was a member of Temple Shalom when she grew up. So ultimately, so all her roots, her family were here in Dallas. So ultimately, when I ended up professionally back in Dallas, Lauren said, this is home. This is where family is. We're going to establish our roots here. So when Verizon, after Mexico, sent me to Dallas because they're international, by that time they had merged with NYNEX and merged with GTE. GTE took over control, management of the international unit. The international unit was based in Las Colinas. And so I started working in Las Colinas, for 2 years until it was obvious that I didn't feel that they knew what they were doing in Latin America. They didn't understand the culture, and they weren't receptive to cultural advice. Sort of, the principal piece of advice being, they're trying to run it like an American unit. Oh, let's give the Latin American entities autonomy. If there's a problem, they'll tell us. No, that's not how it works. They want to be independent. They don't want the gringos controlling them, and they're going to try to hide stuff until the last possible moment. You have to have not spies there, but you have to have involvement. You have to have engagement, because the only way that you're going to find out when there's a problem is if you have established relationships, if they trust you, if they know you're there to help and not there to control. And that's how I developed my relationships in Mexico, and was there in Mexico for 4.5 years, and I felt the same thing was needed in the other Latin American countries, but they didn't want to do it that way. They believed in a hands-off approach, and as a result, they kept on. Ultimately, they wrote off $8 billion, and it was a failure. It was a failure to understand Latin American culture. But I left Verizon before that because I didn't want to participate in selling my babies. I felt, I was angry that I felt they had mismanaged, and I just, I wanted to control where I was going next. So, but the point is, I got kicked upstairs from Mexico once the GTE merger closed. They didn't believe in expats. I enjoyed my expat experience. It was time to come to the United States anyway, since my son was ready to go to kindergarten.
For how many years were you in Mexico?
4.5 years. My wife and son joined me about 8 months afterwards. And our daughter was born in Mexico. So, my wife, Lauren, and I have 2 kids. My son was born in Philadelphia. He was in Mexico from age 1.5 to age 5. He went to, the Yiddisher, which was the model for my mother's Jewish day school in Havana, and he ultimately went to that same school, and because to me, sending my children to Jewish day school was very important. My daughter was too young. She would have, if had we stayed, she would have gone to the Yiddisher, but we left when she was 3 years old, and so we came here and enrolled our children in at Untitled Chapter, which ultimately became Levine Academy. And I had always been a proponent of public schools, but coming to Dallas, how can I say this? I won't be necessarily diplomatic. Jesus is really big in Dallas. And so I felt that it was very important to have a countervailing force. And that countervailing force was Schechter. I think Schechter was a good choice, particularly for my son. The nurturing environment, individual attention, was very good. I think for my daughter, ultimately the class became very small, and she needed a larger group of people, a more social environment. And so after fifth grade, we moved her to public school. But for both of them, I think the Schechter education was an important foundation for their Jewish life. So very happy we set them there.
That's good. And then in what ways, when you came back to Dallas, were you involved in the community, or?
And the involvement was through synagogue.
Yeah. Sheriff?
No. How shall I say this? We did not join Sheriff for two reasons.
Okay.
One, they're an established institution.
Right.
They have a chazan. Shrechter is outstanding.
Mm-hmm.
I was not going to be a chazan there. I like being a high holiday chazan. So we were looking for an alternative. So that was the primary reason, but also, and frankly, Anshe had its congregation, the demographics were our demographics. There were people our age, a little younger, with children, with classmates for my kids. So that was the logical place to go for social reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And so we joined there, and ultimately I started leading the high holiday services, which, as I said, is something that I've done since 1977. So
that's amazing. Is your son gonna follow suit as well?
Neither of my children can sing. I blame my wife's genetics, but let's not discuss that any further. No, but my son has a very deep sense of being Jewish.
That's good.
And he is in Israel right now,
Well,
at Hebrew U in a master's program, and
studying what?
it's a master's in Islamic studies.
Wow.
He was a Russian studies major at Vassar, and then given that the Middle East is such an important area of U.S.-Russian confrontation, he thought it would be useful, and I think it has been useful to understand, Russia's involvement, but from the other perspective, from both an Arabic and Israeli perspective. So that's what this year in Israel is giving him. Also, he's been in Israel before. Before this program, he was at an Ulpan for 5 months at a kibbutz, and he's continuing his Hebrew studies and his and studying Arabic as well. So my son's an academic, and he enjoys this, but ultimately he'll go back to Russian studies. But he feels that this year has been very important in giving him context for the Middle Eastern aspects of Russian foreign policy. So,
do you speak with them Spanish? Do they know any Spanish?
Well, I did when they were kids, because they were fluent, as fluent as a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old could be. But for my son, once he came to Dallas, he basically said, well, none of my friends speak Spanish. And he made this statement, no one in Dallas speaks Spanish. Of course, that's not true. I took him to stores and showed him that, half the people here speak Spanish. And then, one of the, coincidences in life, at Schechter, they hired a new nurse who had been, a school nurse, who had been a school nurse in Mexico. And she comes up to me one day and says, do you have family in Mexico? And I said, no, but we were in Mexico. No, but, why? And she said, well, because I remember a Sylvan Perlmutter in Mexico. And I said, well, I don't have family in Mexico, but that was probably us. Was this at the Yiddisher? And she said, yes. So, well, my son was your patient in that school too. So it's a small world, but that also didn't impress my son. We tried. All of the babysitters spoke Spanish. All of the VHSs and DVDs that we had of Disney movies were the Spanish language version. We tried to reinforce Spanish. We sent, my son to Spanish camp, to Savannah, to Minnesota, and even to Mexico for 2 weeks to try to reinforce the Spanish. But it didn't take until later in high school. He spent a year of high school in Latin America, and so he reinforced his Spanish then.
So he's in Israel, and your daughter, you said?
My daughter, she misses Mexico. She has this nostalgic sense of what Mexico represented. She misses her nanny. She misses the drivers. She misses her best friend, Monsi, and has never forgiven me for moving from Mexico. So anytime I spoke Spanish to her, it made her cry because it made her remember everything that she lost in moving from Mexico.
She was young, no?
Sort of, I was repeating the trauma that I supposedly experienced. I was inflicting that on my children, apparently. So my daughter, I think she understands Spanish, but is reluctant to speak it. And she studied in high school, so.
And with coming from Cuba, although you were, little, what, I guess, Cuban Jewish cultural traditions or, family traditions have you maintained, whether it was food, holidays that you rooted from your family?
Well, it's the cultural influences. The holidays are the holidays. We celebrate them in Ashkenazi style. It's not as if we became Sephardic and said, let's have yellow rice on Passover. I've been thinking about it, but we haven't done that. But I think that in the day-to-day food, you see that, whether it's we have more black beans than the normal American family has, because in Cuba you had black beans and rice with everything. So arroz con pollo we have, flan we have. Of course, my favorite dessert, which is not readily available outside of Miami, is natilla, which is a vanilla custard, which is outstanding. It's great, but it's not readily available here. But when I go to Miami, it's there are two soul foods. You go to a deli and you have soul food, and you go to Miami to a Cuban restaurant and have my other soul food. So the culinary aspects of Cuba are very important. Musically, the influence of Cuban music has always been that, other people might have liked the rock and roll. I always enjoyed rhythm more. So while other people were listening to the Beatles, I was listening to Motown, just because that was more rhythmically similar to Latin music. I'm sure I did Israeli folk dancing because I enjoyed dancing, because that was part of the culture. And I have taken lessons in in salsa dancing, and I know how to cha-cha and rumba and you know, which are Cuban dances. So yeah, so I think in that aspect,
you brought the culture with you.
we brought the culture here. I'm very proud that I'm Hispanic. Although I had to fight for that identity too. I remember in high school, you know, people whose parents were born in Cuba who were not Jewish were basically, you know, first of all, you're not a real, you know, they kept on saying you're not a real Cuban. You can't be Jewish and Cuban. Well, one is religion, although being a Jew is peoplehood. It's mixed, but you know, you don't have to, you know, you can be a Cuban without being Catholic. But they said I wasn't a real Cuban, and I used to not fight fair, because what I responded was, okay, where were you born? The Bronx. Where was I born? Havana. Who's the Cuban? But again, I'm revisiting the same trauma on my daughter, who was born in Mexico, is Mexican, but if she meets, you know, Chicanos, they're going, or you know, Mexican Americans here in Texas who are fourth generation, you know, Texans, they're going to say you're not really Mexican because you're Jewish. But she was born there, and of course my mother was born there as well. So, you know, we're you know, we're now going on 3 generations of family members, you know, born in Latin American countries, whose Latinness is in question. So.
And have you been to Cuba ever since?
Yeah, we went for 8 days. I think at the end of 2015 was it, and just in the Havana area. We spent 4 days seeing the sights, and then 4 days trying to track down where everybody lived and worked. So, you know, and that included the hospital I was born, my grandparents' houses, the schools that my mother went to and taught at, you know, where my uncles lived and had their businesses, you know, the Jewish, you know, the synagogues, the Jewish cemeteries. That took 4 days, and with some repetition, because it took, you know, I may not have been successful the first time, but then, you know, I figured it out, called one of my uncles here in the States, and you know, made the necessary itinerary corrections to find the places that I couldn't find the first time. So yes, I enjoyed it. Yeah, Cuba's dilapidated, but so much potential. The people I thought were wonderful. You know, you know, they spirited, not downtrodden by, you know, Cubans like to kvetch. They complain, and as long as they complain, I think they're okay. But everyone seemed to be fed. They were clothed. You didn't have beggars on the street. Actually, unfortunately, the only begging that I experienced was by poor Orthodox Jews in front of the Orthodox synagogue. You know, I did go to Shabbos services at the Patronato. I did lead Musaf services there, which is sort of one of my bucket list things. But how can I say this? I wasn't particularly fond of the director of the synagogue, who was a communist apparatchik. And, you know, I understand the political position that she's in, but, and, you know, her basic role, her role is to try to raise as much money as she can from the Joint Distribution Committee and visiting Jews, and try to stave off the government from taking any more of the synagogue. So, you know, her focus is politics, not Judaism. You can sense that in speaking with her. So that's Adela Dworkin, who's may still be the head of the community, but
has the nationalism, like has has it died down over there? And
in terms of,
like
well,
the corruption and it taking over businesses and
no, they nationalized everything. Under Castro, things were less corrupt, but you had to be a party member. You didn't have any political freedom. If you expressed dissent, you were jailed, and they've killed 20,000+ people in the 50 years of the Castro regime. What but what's left unsaid is, in Batista's last 7 years of power, they killed 3,000 people. The difference is Batista killed leftist students, and Castro killed, dissenters who were not necessarily right wing, but not on the left. But in both cases, they were murderous regimes. But under Batista, you could leave.
right.
Under Castro, it wasn't that easy to leave after March of 1961. Although, the people there, in terms of the Jewish community there, the Jewish community was relatively well treated. Why? Because there were so few of them. The Jews that remained were mostly poor or mostly pro-Castro. So they were small. They weren't political opposition, so Castro could treat them relatively well and demonstrate to the world, see, I'm a tolerant man. Look, I allowed the Jewish community to survive. And yeah, within limits. But the membership of at least the Patronato is, a lot of people are just rediscovering their Jewish roots. And one of the reasons is because they can go there and have a good meal once or twice a week, because there's Shabbos dinner and Shabbos lunch. And in a country where the average worker makes, $2, a day, excuse me, that's significant. So you have a big crowd Friday night and Saturday because people stay for the meal.
Non-Jews too?
No, they have Jewish roots. Halachically, they may not be Jewish, but they have one Jewish parent, and they deem themselves Jewish, or opportunistically decide, I want to have a chicken meal, so I'm going to be Jewish. But they're learning, they're relearning, ritual, and they don't have a permanent rabbi. There, at least the Patronato, there is a permanent rabbi in the Orthodox Ashkenazi shul. But there is a sense of community, and food attracts them, and also the fact that the Patronato has the best pharmacy in all of Cuba.
Really?
Because the Joint Distribution Committee sends, a lot of pharmaceuticals, so they're very well stocked. But no, you have 150 people on Shabbos, both Friday night and Saturday morning.
That's amazing. I've always wanted to go. I heard it's
fascinating, and you should go before. In another 10 years, I suspect the Biden administration will remove whatever restrictions Trump reimposed, and Cuba will get a lot of investment and will modernize. And I think it's good to go before they completely reconstruct and redevelop Cuba.
I heard it's like going back in time when you do go.
Yes, 25% of the cars are cars from the 1950s. It is spectacular.
Well, Ruben, for last comments, I just wanted to ask you, of all the things, your parents taught you or you learned from them, what do you feel was the most valuable that brought you to where you are today?
Perseverance. My parents had to go through, my father in particular, had to go through a lot of challenges that I don't know that I could you know, that I could face. I mean, my father was facing death, you know, for every day for 3 years. You know, starvation, cold, Nazis, Stalinists, um, and yet he persevered and he lived you know a good life. Um, and so and my mother also sort of, you know, losing everything once, not you know, 4 times like my father. And you know, sort of still, you know, even with the frustration and the sadness, you know, pushing on and continuing and building a good solid life in the United States. And you know, we're thankful, very thankful that you know, we found a place that we could live and thrive, a place we could live as Jews without um, too much hostility. You know, Dallas in 2020 is much less hostile to Jews than it was, you know, in 1970. Um, and you know, it's you know, so I guess you learn that no matter how bad things are, there is in fact light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll just get through it and rebuild. And that's it.
Yeah. Well, Ruben, thank you again for sharing all these really thoughtful, like interesting and thoughtful stories. Is there any other stories that you wanted to share that we didn't get to?
I'm trying to see. I'm looking at the question list.
Yeah.
And no, we covered everything. I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you for your time, and thank you for letting me go off on tangents. And I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, have a very happy New Year.
Likewise.